With deception and misinformation rife, the Allies took to the air to deliver even more distractions for the Germans. Building on the groundwork laid by Operation Fortitude South, they reinforced the idea of a fictitious invasion in Calais. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, as troops went to the real invasion point in Normandy, a squadron of boats and bombers set to divide the German troops. Knowing an invasion force as big as the one heading to Normandy would almost certainly be picked up by enemy radar, the Allies set out a plan to distract and delay German forces. One of the operations devised for this was called Operation Glimmer. Throughout the late night of June 5th and the early hours of June 6th, the 218 Squadron, utilising short Stirling bombers, dropped chaff between Dover and Calais. Chaff is thin strips of metal. It was deployed to disrupt enemy radar, causing it to detect multiple large objects and creating the impression of a substantial amphibious fleet. The dropping of chaff was complemented by small unmanned boats, towing behind them transponders. These transponders would usually be towed by bombers during their flight. As easy as it sounds, the operation was rather complex. The bombers would have to fly in a complicated circular pattern and drop the chaff at the perfect time to mimic the size, the speed, the shape of an invasion fleet. Under the second operation, Operation Taxable, a larger fleet of Lancasters from the 617 Squadron replicated the same practice. This time simulating an attack towards the Pt.2 near the major port town of Le Havre. Some of the first boots on the ground on D-Day were the paratroopers part of Operation Titanic, landing just after midnight on June 6th. Operation Titanic involved dropping dummy parachuters alongside real paratroopers. The dummies themselves were a lot smaller than life size, however the darkness of night would make them appear actual size. I wanted to know more about Operation Titanic and D-Day itself, so I headed down to the D-Day story in Portsmouth and was lucky enough to speak to their curator, Andrew Whitmarsh.
So this particular one wasn't used in Normandy because effectively they would have been destroyed in use, but it's the type of that was used in World War II. So they were used on D-Day either side of the landing beaches. There were airborne drops, and then so real airborne troops landing, and then a bit further afield on either side near the airborne drops, they dropped these dummy paratroopers. So there were about 500 of them dropped in Normandy at different points. And the idea was that from a distance, when it's in the air, you can see the parachute here, it would have looked like a normal paratrooper. On a dark night, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Yeah. There were other kind of clever details, like some of them were fitted with equipment that when they landed it would set off firecrackers that would sound like a gunfight. There were also some members of the SAS, the Special Air Service, who landed with them in the same areas and then played recordings of sounds of battle. So it was basically to confuse the Germans as to exactly where the airborne landings were taking place, the parachute landings and glider landings.
And it's called a Rupert, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what they're known as. I think there is, as far as there's different theories for the name.
Yeah.
I'm not sure anyone absolutely knows, but my favourite one really is that Rupert was also a name for a junior army officer, and I'd like to think that some sort of slightly unkind person drew a parallel between this inanimate dummy and a sort of fairly sort of useless because of his inexperienced army officer, and said, well, they're effectively the same thing.
That's good.
Which is a bit cruel, but that's my favourite theory about where the name came from.
Approximately 500 dummies were dropped in these locations. These locations complemented Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer, adding to the illusion that an invasion was happening 80 kilometres away from Normandy. The objectives of Operation Titanic were largely accomplished. On June 6th, around 2 AM, German units reported seeing paratroopers landing in the area, as well as hearing the boats out at sea for Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer. However, the level of response rapidly diminished upon discovering just dummy paratroopers landing in the area. During the massive air operation in the support of the invasion, even though the Allies enjoyed almost all air superiority, the risk of friendly fire was real. With countless aircraft in the sky, a fail-safe identification system needed to come into effect.
In some previous amphibious operations, particularly the landings in Sicily in 1943, there'd been a lot of friendly fire incidents. In other words, Allied ships seeing Allied aircraft flying overhead, not realising that they were Allied, and shooting them, and sometimes shooting them down. So invasion stripes, where these black and white stripes were put on the wings and fuselage of aircraft just before D-Day as an easy way for any Allied forces to recognise what was an Allied aircraft. How the invasion stripes were applied was simply doing it as quickly as possible, because they often had lots of aircraft to put the stripes onto, so they wouldn't necessarily have done it very neatly. They'd just applied the paint as quickly with fairly basic equipment as quickly as they could.
Although the directive to apply markings were widespread, it had to be a closely guarded secret. There was genuine concern that if the Luftwaffe caught wind of the plans, they might try and mimic the markings themselves. Despite the finalisation and approval of the idea coming on May 17, 1944, it wasn't until June 3rd when all troop carrier units received the order. And it wasn't until June 4th when all bomber and fighter squadrons received the order to paint the markings on their aircraft. With the initial date for D-Day set for June 5th, the scramble to apply the markings had begun. Now if you're a modeller, I'm sure the urge is there to paint the lines as perfect as possible on your model aircraft. In reality, a lot of the stripes were painted hastily and weren't neat, and in some cases washed off by the time they had returned. Of course, some aircraft were painted with extreme precision, but others were painted with mops and were still wet when they left the ground. For all the modellers watching this video, here's a challenge for you. Why not grab an aircraft with D-Day markings, and instead of going for perfectly applied D-Day stripes, try and replicate the hurried atmosphere which took place on airfields in the hours prior to D-Day. On June 6th, reportedly over 14,000 sorties were carried out, with no real reports of friendly fire. In fact, only 100 aircraft were actually shot down. In fact, it was later claimed that not a single Allied aircraft was lost to friendly fire in D-Day, a testament to the effective and secretive planning that went into Operation Overlord.